The following episode is part of a series produced in conjunction with the 14th Shanghai Biennale titled Cosmos Cinema.
Well, hello and welcome to the e-flux podcast. My name is Ben Eastham. I'm part of the curatorial team for the current Shanghai Biennale, which is entitled Cosmos Cinema and is showing at the Power Station of Art through to the end of March. To mark the exhibition, we're conducting a series of short interviews with artists featured in the show, considering their work and its relationship to the show's overarching themes. And I'm very pleased today to welcome Alice Wang onto the podcast. Hello, Alice.
Hi, Ben.
So, in addition to showing at the Biennale, Alice was the subject of a major solo exhibition at the UCCA June Art Museum in Qinhuangdou that closed just last week, and has a show forthcoming at the Vincent Price Art Museum in the spring. She will participate in the International Program Residency, the ISCP in New York, later this year, and has previously presented solo exhibitions at Capsule Shanghai, Human Resources in Los Angeles, the 18th Street Art Center in Santa Monica, and OCAP Museum in Xi'an. She's also participated in group exhibitions, screenings and performances at Los Angeles Contemporary Exhibitions, Armory Center of the Arts, Parasite, K11 Art Foundation in Hong Kong, and The Hammer. So just to situate our listeners a little bit, Alice's untitled sculpture included in the Biennale is a floor piece comprised of over 100,000 interlocking black and white tiles. It lies at the heart of a section of the Biennale that reflects upon the different ways in which we map time and space, and is visible from several different perspectives, from the ground level as people walk past it, but also by viewers from the balconies on upper floors and from the elevators that rise over the Power Station of Art, which is a repurposed electricity station on the banks of the Huangpu River. So perhaps, Alice, if you don't mind, you could just begin by telling us a little bit about the work, the ideas behind it, the materials of which it's made, and the manner of its arrangement.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, it's 100,000 hand-painted tiles, and they actually range from black to white in sort of this grayscale, 11 colors in between. And I guess, if you believe in the Big Bang, our universe began 13.8 billion years ago with this massive explosion that happened, which scientists in the 1970s discovered through radio telescopes that we can still, quote unquote, hear that sound of the explosion. And so with, sort of everyday appliances like the television or radio, we can actually receive the transmissions from the past. This so-called sound fossil was something I was quite interested in exploring as a material. Of course, it's something that's invisible, yet palpable. And so one thing I thought would be interesting was to use a sort of an index of it that was translated from the electromagnetic waves into, from the radio section of the EMS spectrum into the visible spectrum, which is, you can see it in the television. When back in the day before we went digital, you can still see snow on the television, and that snow is sort of the scrambling of a chaotic signal, and embedded within that snow is the cosmic background radiation, which is that explosion that you can hear. And when I first was looking at this image, I wasn't really sure how to exactly translate it into a sculptural form. And so part of my practice in looking into sculpture is to think about it as a framework to explore metaphysical questions. And so when I was presented an opportunity actually to exhibit at Human Resources in Los Angeles, it's a former movie theater. And so in the main exhibition space, it's this vast atrium-like cube. And then on the second floor, there are these projection booths that were turned into galleries. So I was quite interested in seeing how I can make a sculpture that presented different vantage points and allowed sort of different ontological sort of being of the sculpture. So when you first, as you mentioned earlier in the introduction, when you first enter the exhibition space on its the same level of this as the sculpture, it is this flat, massive flat object. But when you approach it from the second floor or other higher elevations and looking down at it, you can really see it as an image. So I was interested in how both it's this immersive physical phenomenological experience, as if you're engulfed by this chaotic field, but at the same time, when you are higher up, you can see its entirety as an image, as something that's providing almost like a semiotic meaning that we recognize it to be chaos. So I was really interested in how sculpture as a medium could shapeshift actually into these different things.
So this is effectively one way of representing the white noise that we otherwise see on analog televisions when they're detuned, right? It's the same phenomenon. It's the same background radiation. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And so when you're arranging these tiles that are black and white and, degrees in between, when you're organizing them on the floor, what governs their arrangement? What's the kind of guiding principle behind this chaos?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I have a map, and the map itself is this, a 750-page document or book, and so it printed on A4 paper, and each map is 12 inches by 12 inches. And so it's a very sort of, labor-intensive activity. When I was making it myself, I thought of it as almost like, the Tibetan sand paintings when they make the mandala. It's this, multiple people are hovering over this massive flat object. I think it was very much inspired by, I actually saw it in the Herzog film where he went to Tibet. Yeah, and so it's like this, like laboring over this thing, this image that was really very much a portal into sort of a different dimension. And normally, to me, it's that information is, of course, an integral part of the work. But to me, it's more the work is sort of released almost from that originary sort of inspiration, but becomes sort of. I was much more interested in it as like this chaotic sort of field or this sea of turbulence, and when your eyes get locked into it, it really kind of draws you in. And I sort of imagine my mind sort of swimming in it, sort of taking it out of the physicality of it, but into the sort of imaginary space.
Yeah, the thing I guess about having these two different perspectives on it in the Biennale is that up close from ground level, it does appear as chaos. It's incredibly immersive. It feels like it brings you in, but doesn't. It's very difficult to construct anything out of it. But actually, when you do go up to the kind of mezzanine levels and look down, I found myself beginning to identify patterns, even though I know that the patterns aren't conscious or deliberate. But actually, it's very difficult to prevent one's mind from finding these kind of organizations or patterns, let's say. And I wondered if that was related in some way to this idea. You've talked about the work existing at the kind of, you mentioned it there, between chaos and order, or between what we can understand and what we can't understand. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that kind of border zone and how your work interrogates it or attempts to slip between the two.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point, because when I was making it, I was just following this map, this almost mindlessly following a map. But then once it was installed, I realized that, the feeling of chaos or the feeling of turbulence, it's actually quite difficult to construct, because somehow, when you do think that you're making chaos, there is always some sort of internal logic to it. And I realized that what we perceive as chaos is just a language that we have no access to, but that there's always some kind of order in the universe. We just are not privy to it at the moment for some reason, or we don't have enough knowledge to it. And I think for me that sort of opens up the space for mystery, for the unknown, and for uncertainty. And that's, I think, what I find fascinating about that sort of borderline that you're talking about, this sort of threshold, sort of at the limits of our knowing, at the limits of language, at the limits of seeing or sensing.
Yeah, I mean, the feeling, I think the word I always associate with that work, particularly as it was installed, was wonder. And it's very much this idea that actually it's pushing at the boundaries of what can be known. And also makes very clear, I think, that human perception is limited to a very narrow register. Let's say our spectrum is small, and I guess we can construct patterns or meaning or order out of that which falls within this relatively narrow, visible, audible spectrum. But actually, it feels like this work and your work generally alerts viewers to the existence of registers way beyond our conventional register, let's say. And I was really interested by that actually this idea that how do we push beyond it? What does it mean to find ways to articulate or express phenomena that by their nature exist outside our ability to recognize, but then to translate them into something that does give them some kind of form, or however contingent, and yet to still preserve that sense of mystery or strangeness. I think you wrote or said of a work that showed at UCCA, which was this twinned black and white sculptures, that the physical boundary of the work is not limited to its visible expression. And I wondered if you could expand on that idea a little bit, the idea that actually the work might extend beyond our ability to see it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. That sort of is almost like a through line that touches on all of my work, my entire practice, I would say. There's a few things behind it. One of them is, of course, I'm very much inspired by science, but not in, I would say, if there is a traditional way artists are inspired by science. So first of all, I grew up with, my father was a theoretical physicist. He's no longer working, but he was working on what's called a megawatt microwave, laser beam that was meant to intercept intercontinental ballistic missiles during the Cold War. And so, he was working within the electromagnetic spectrum of the parts that are invisible to the eye, but extremely deadly. And growing up, I don't even know how it seeped in, but to me, it was always kind of this magical thing that, of course, we understand science to be something that's, very factual and absolute and, the truth. But at the same time, it's again, this it straddles this boundary between fact and fiction and fantasy and truth. And so, mystery and science was always kind of going hand in hand for me. And when I started, making sculpture after graduate school, I was very drawn to working with forces that are invisible but palpable, always searching for something that, is just beyond, again, this knowable space, just beyond something that's, you can almost touch it, but you don't know it, this drive to seek that space. And it really kind of stems from a deep sense of curiosity and, as you said, wonder for the world. And going back to the sculptures that you're talking about, the black and white porcelain sculptures are modeling the entanglement properties of subatomic particles, specifically hydrogen electrons. And so when I first began this project, I was very curious about quantum computers because I studied computer science and was, sort of learned all about, ones and zeros and the sort of firing on and off. And that made sense to me because it was very much grounded in this mechanistic idea of the universe as something that is, sort of very clear, But the quantum realm is really this space of speculation and probabilities. So I was teaching at NYU Shanghai at the time and got in touch with my colleague, this physicist who is running the NYU Quantum Technology Lab. And so he brought me to his lab and showed me the quantum computer that he's building and the facilities, and they're just working with like photons or atoms, the, the things that, the building blocks of the universe, of, us, but that we cannot see it at all. And he sort of turned me on to this very interesting application called Mathematica. And I learned all about, hydrogen electrons that could be modeled, the probabilistic clouds. So actually, the sculptures that you're talking about, they're actually almost like the DNA of the hydrogen electrons. And I was interested in the sort of entanglement property that makes quantum computers so powerful, that you can sort of shift states. I don't know, it has its own like autonomous decision making process. And so that's why they're sort of in this sort of phenomenologically opposition in effect. One is crackled glaze in white. So when you look at the surface, it's all cracked, whereas the other one is this black, shiny glaze. And this work is actually sort of the second of another series that I made originally in stainless steel, where the stainless steel was mirror finish. So the mirror finish is reflecting all light, and its twin counterpart is this matte black finish, this absorbing light. And so when you look at these sculptures, what's happening is actually you're leaving the Newtonian physical world and like leaping into the subatomic realm. Almost like, Alice in Wonderland, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much. What's interesting is like both those twin sculptures, as you talk about them, both those sculptures and the work you presented at the Biennale, I guess in their consideration of phenomena that are deeply antithetical to a mechanistic construction of the universe, either the idea that we're underpinned by this kind of chaotic background radiation, or that there is, this form of entanglement which fundamentally seems to work against the principle of cause and effect. Like both of these are fundamental principles that really undermine at a very basic level the way we organize the world. I mean, just on a day-to-day basis, how our minds create order out of the world, how we assume that there is a world which will continue to behave in ways that are predictable to us. And it was interesting when you were talking about your father, like my brother worked at MIT for a long time and was similarly engaged in he was actually in kind of weather and engineering, but I had the same experience of him, of just, talking about this and realizing how far into the realms of kind of pure speculation it was. And this idea that actually this kind of scientific inquiry wasn't secure, actually, in the way that I think one tends to assume that scientific inquiry is, that its foundations were totally, were really shaky when you got down to it. And that actually it was speculative and strange. And then you reach this point, I think, which is kind of what interests me in your work, or as you talk about it, that actually when you get down to these very fundamental levels, then the conventional language doesn't work any longer. And actually both in kind of mathematical language, but also in terms of just the way we speak about the world, no longer holds. And actually it then becomes important to find other forms of language or other ways of thinking. And it's interesting then seeing, I guess, a lot of people working in quantum physics reach for, or look to Buddhism, for instance, as a way of potentially figuring that kind of chaos or emptiness. But also the idea that really when you get to those points, you have to find a way of speaking or communicating that is unconventional because the language doesn't hold. And actually your work seems very much engaged in that. Like, what are the ways of figuring this? How do you present it in ways that aren't, I guess, beholden to ideas that no longer really function at that level? And that seems to me compelling. And I wonder if you think of it in those terms as a kind of, I think it sounds like a little bit like you did. Like you're trying to find, not to kind of communicate just a sense of wonder, but actually to push right at that sense of what you can articulate, that actually these might be ways of not only kind of hinting at the unknown, but pushing the boundaries of the known a little by finding different registers, by finding different ways of figuring these things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to kind of backtrack a little bit. When you're talking about this is so several years ago, I was, really kind of grappling with this fact of our sort of being in the world right now is not aligned with, scientific understandings of reality, which is really troubling because, so then I started looking into that moment in the Renaissance when we went from a geocentric worldview into a heliocentric worldview, looking into Copernicus's life. And, it's such a fascinating moment that he didn't, get burnt at the stake, although this other scientist, Bruno, did, Bruno, I think, was the first one that was talking about the sun possibly being the center of the universe. Yeah, I haven't really reconciled with it. But I think what you're suggesting is, I think in some ways, what I'm trying to do within my art practice itself is trying to navigate that space where how do you operate within the unknown, and recognizing that I'm not interested in, sort of operating within the domain of knowledge that we are already sort of like almost like feeling super secured about. And part of that, I think, for me is in any exhibition making process, always trying to sort of establish a kind of framework. And you mentioned my exhibitions at 18th Street Art Center, for example, which is my first solo show I've ever done. And the press release I wrote for it made absolutely no sense to most people. And I realized, in some ways it was kind of like a career suicide. The first show that you're going to have, nobody understands you. And that's already like your work is not understandable to begin with. And sort of follow suit with, my first show at Capsule, what I presented was actually these letters to give the secret away. The letters it was actually just basically the periodic table, but written as letters. A friend of mine was like, "Oh, that looks like an alien language," and I thought that was quite beautiful. That it could be an alien language, but the periodic table is the fundamental building blocks of everything, And so, I think I'm always trying to figure out a way to sort of tote that line, but whether or not I'm successful at it, it's always there's that attempt at trying to do it.
It's really beautiful. I think actually it brings us to one thing that I did want to talk about, which is I'm kind of wary of making your work sound, because it's so deeply engaged in kind of scientific principles and theory, but it's also incredibly effective. And I wondered if we might talk, I'm conscious actually that time is passing very quickly, but if we might talk about that, I might communicate that idea. And that there was a line from one of your films called Oracle, which really struck me when I was watching it. And maybe I can just read that line, and if you wouldn't mind responding to it. The line was, "I admit I've been feeling pretty melancholic lately, in general, about being in this world, a kind of geometric sadness." And it was that geometric sadness that I was particularly struck by. I wondered if you might expand on geometric sadness.
Yeah, this is something I have to sort of figure out how to articulate, because one of the things I realized it's, I feel like I wish I was a poet, because I feel like poetry is something that's sort of, the use of language is almost like the sculptor using materials. And the way that I think of art is through this sort of poetic lens or an aesthetic experience. But the sort of collapsing of two words that creates this space that has so much dimension to it. One of the things I realized is that up until my early 20s, I was on this track to become either a computer programmer or getting into international affairs. I also studied international relations. So I'm coming from this very sort of either mathematical or rational, logical mind, examining the international system, very sort of inclined to almost like a linear thinking, but thinking in this, I would, just call it like the Apollonian way, but at the same time, I'm so drawn to the sort of feelings and desire and pleasure and play. And so I was always sort of thinking about how does one reconcile this collapse of the Apollonian, the Dionysian, and really that I'm in between these two realms, I'm not just like a science person. I am interested in aesthetic experiences and poetry and feelings and emotions. So I think for me, that phrase geometric sadness it allows that sort of collapse. And the line that you read is a scene from the film where, I filmed it with another artist, Ben Tong, and we went to Biosphere 2 in Arizona, which is this sort of enclosed 3-acre, literally Earth number 2 on Earth. And that scene was filmed in this glass and steel structure where it's supposed to simulate the ocean, right? So we're like the geometric forms that are reflecting from the sun onto the water, and we're like rowing a boat. Yeah.
It's a beautiful phrase. It really communicates that idea of, I guess, order being complicated by chaos and chaos being complicated by order. And yeah, this idea that, I guess, art and literature and even science in its speculative sense always exist at that boundary between what we know and what we don't know, between what we've imposed order upon and what we can't work out. I think it's a beautiful phrase and a lovely way to end. I'm sorry we can't talk more, but I'll get told off by the people doing the other podcast. So I just wanted to say thank you so much, Alice. It's been a real pleasure, and we're so grateful to have your work in the Biennale. It's such a key work, and actually so central to it, both literally and metaphorically. So thank you.
Thank you.